8 dark truths that make you intellectually dangerous. It sounds almost flattering until you notice the second meaning. Dangerous to whom and for what? A more straightforward illustration of this idea can be found in controlled laboratory experiments. In 1963, Stanley Milgram carried out his now famous obedience experiments at Yale University. Participants were led to believe that they were administering electric shocks to others. The troubling finding was that obedience to authority, rather than any inherent viciousness, influenced their actions. The experimenters' calm and controlled demeanor set the tone of the room. When the authority figure showed any uncertainty, compliance among participants decreased. This illustrates how emotional stability can be a tool to foster control, even when the orders are morally dubious. This phenomenon is often referred to as psychological invincibility. It describes a person who, by not absorbing the anxieties of others, becomes a benchmark, shaping the emotional states of those around them. I've observed this dynamic play out in corporate settings. A CEO announces layoffs without showing a flicker of emotion. Employees scrutinize their leader's face, searching for any clue of emotions. When they see none, two things often happen. First, there could be a rise in resentment. Second, compliance becomes the standard. The emotional void compels individuals to seek resolve internally. The reactive personality is a stark contrast to this behavior. Examples include a manager who feels compelled to respond to every accusation, a politician impulsively countering criticism on social media, or a partner who disproportionately reacts to the slightest perceived rejection. While such displays of emotion might be perceived as honest, they also offer those around them valuable data to use and exploit. Each reaction becomes a piece of intelligence. Traditional psychology often describes emotional intelligence in terms of empathy and sensitivity. Daniel Goleman promoted this concept in the mainstream during the 1990s, arguing that the capability to understand and handle emotions is important for effective leadership. Yet, a basic flaw in this understanding lies in confusing the management of emotions with their outward expression. The most enduring leaders are frequently those who regulate, rather than openly display, their feelings. The difference is important. I used to believe that authenticity was equal to stability. Negotiation studies at Harvard during the 80s and 90s advocated principled negotiation and transparency regarding one's needs. That works best when both sides trust each other. The more invested a party seems in a certain outcome, the more pressure they tend to feel. This is known as asymmetry of reactivity. Consider two individuals under public attack. One holds a composed press conference, carefully selecting their words and addressing only the key points. The other makes statements in real time, defending themselves point by point and correcting every detail. The first one conveys calm. The second one seems deeply involved. Studies on how authority and general impressions shape how others view individuals, which began with Edward Thorndike's work in 1920, suggest that people see those who appear calm as more skillful. Calmness is directly thought to mean competence. That said, there's a delicate equilibrium to be maintained. Exhibiting emotional detachment isn't about an absence of feelings. It's about strategically concealing any emotional reliance. Machiavelli suggested that an effective leader should seem virtuous, kind, faithful, honest, and religious, but must be prepared to act differently when necessary. This is often interpreted as evidence of his cynical views. Machiavelli's point is about emotional self-preservation, project an image of accessibility, but don't be truly available. That difference can be critical for success and security. Consider advisors working on major political races. Anecdotes from the inside often reveal that a candidate's upset reaction to poor polling can shatter the cohesion of a team. If the candidate refrains from reacting publicly, even while privately frustrated, the team regroups. The leader's emotional control becomes a container holding others together. This can create feelings of unease in those around those emotionally controlled. Co-workers may label such individuals as hard to read, cold, and distant. Romantic partners might describe them as aloof. Reporters may characterize them as disciplined. It can be difficult to relate to them because their inner emotional states are difficult to read. People want to have impact. In 1974, psychologist Ellen Langer showed how a sense of personal control can produce change in a person's behavior. When people think they can influence something, they show more involvement. If it is taken from them, the way they act changes. Someone who has control of what they are feeling removes an obvious way to influence them. Not being able to anticipate how someone will react prevents manipulation. It's also more than surface-level confidence. Being emotionally protected goes deeper. It's not allowing your emotions to be manipulated. I did not expect to see the extent to which this contrasts current ideas about transparency. Workplaces say they reward transparency, but often give advancement to those who can handle pressure without showing it. People say they find vulnerability appealing, but tend to follow those with self-possession and balance. So, is it a strength to be emotionally controlled, or are you just distant? The answer depends. Strength means having inner strength. Being distant means having a deliberate plan. In real life, the two are joined. Over a long period of strategic non-reactivity changes you inside. A method becomes a way of thinking. There's a tension. If those in positions of power are those with the most self-control of what they're feeling, what happens to the places that are built on being truthful and open? Does real strength always go to the one who doesn't show? The hard rules don't begin with being cruel. They begin with protection. Once protection works, the core question becomes greater than avoiding manipulation. It's about how far someone is willing to go so that their vulnerabilities go undiscovered. Protection preserves emotion. Focus preserves power. Before trying to control budgets, people, outcomes, or choices, you must first control the narrative. As the narrative stays the same, what happens around it changes to reflect it. This is how the concept of just presenting your true self started to fail. I used to think being true to myself was a strength. Then I looked at how first impressions are created. In 1920, psychologist Edward Thorndike defined the halo effect. When one characteristic, such as confidence or charm, biases how other traits, such as intelligence or morals, are viewed. Subsequent studies have confirmed this. In hiring studies, submitting identical resumes that only change a photo gave people very different thoughts regarding the applicant's skill. Thinking replaced proof. This is a basic leaning. When a CEO presents on stage in simple clothing, in the style of Steve Jobs at Apple events, that clothing becomes part of the message. Simple, control, eyes on tomorrow. An announcement comes across like a planned show with tempo, language, and lighting deliberately set. A product is labeled revolutionary before it has ever been handled. The consensus follows. The story remains. People are not measuring. They're affirming how they imagine the product will make them feel. Apple grasped what Machiavelli knew. People evaluate mostly by observing, and that very few know who you really are. These ideas have been used in darker experiments. Stanley Milgram's 1963 experiments saw people willing to inflict shocks on complete strangers. The one in charge wore an authoritative uniform, spoke with clear composure, and cited their affiliation with Yale. The level of shock became less important. People were following direction, irrespective of results. When a setting was subtly changed to a normal office building, less people obliged. The narrative, not the reality, held supreme. The brain uses assumptions. Analysis almost always starts from biases. Company public relations focus precisely on this. After someone was killed by extra-strength Tylenol laced with cyanide in 1982, Johnson and AMP, Johnson successfully framed the episode as sabotage instead of negligence. They recalled all their products and cooperated with authorities. Their narrative communicated that they were both responsible and victims. Initial sales declined, but then recovered. In comparison to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of 2010, BP focused on minimizing the incident. Images of leadership dismissing the consequences ran alongside images of oil-soaked animals and the rigs on fire. The narrative failed. The narrative was not believed. Public anger went through the roof. The difference between the events was in what was shown and absorbed within the first 72 hours. For employees in the organization, perception influences how employees are feeling. Clear updates by a leader can make the results be easier to handle. The team falls apart as the message changes or when lies start to spread. Inconsistent messaging creates uncertainty, and employees are not able to determine what's true. Political image building has even more transparent proof. The 1960s debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy showed how important outside appearances are. People listening on the radio thought it was a draw. TV viewers heavily favored Kennedy, who was in control, tan, and steady. Nixon was uneasy, pale, and sweating on camera. The policies did not reflect the perception of them. The camera flipped the election. In any new election, advisors dedicate money to testing narratives and researching policies. It allows them to instantly try different forms of messaging and the way different ones are received and absorbed. Tone is adjusted, pictures are swapped, and views are tracked instantly. The users see fragments aligning with what they already imagine. The claim that transparency is good then becomes fragile. Social media sites often advertise themselves the site for true, authentic content. Influencers build vulnerability, change the lighting, carefully choose the angles, and use timing when making reveals. Studies on self-presentation have shown that users create an image to generate feedback. Even seeming spontaneous is planned. I did not expect how quickly fake traits would be received when action are consistent. Experiments by Leon Festinger showed that people switch what they want so what they're doing lines up more to avoid feeling uneasy. Supporters defend that leader from anyone showing different evidence. Proving one wrong then becomes difficult. Why is it that we react more strongly to these made-up stories than the real one? Dealing with reality takes energy. A story provides clarity and makes a complex situation less confusing. It divides the good from the bad and shows the sides. Machiavelli recognized this before cognitive psychology. He suggested leaders should seem honest even while strategizing. It is because viewers view action via that view. An action from a true leader can then be seen as true strength. The same one by a bad actor is corruption. The action is the same. What's watched will flip the results. A leader referred to as forward-thinking receives patience amid failure. A worker referred to as poor receives feedback from small mistakes. Workers feel how the feedback is gathered. Investors have reacted to the tone on call more than the data. The jury has listened to the attorneys talk about someone before discussing truth. The scary result is that truth matters less. The truth must fight in the unfair world. What someone sees dictates how facts are watched, forgotten, and forgiven. If you follow how things work, the fields switch. Trying to control the world without controlling watchers isn't steady. The image has to meet its structure. If perception defeats the true narrative, then why stop trying to ensure harmony between image and story? Dependence is the weakness. If emotional distance creates power, what if distance is deliberately created for power? This would require a deliberate manipulation of what is watched. While we're shown trust is made from steadiness. Predictability is built for security in families. Clear expectations reduce anxiety within groups. By understanding how influence is applied, you can show new patterns that arise. Burr has Frederick Skinner defined during 1950s that if you add inconsistency, they are difficult to erase. This behavior persists even without constant rewards. Casinos embrace this mechanism. Slot machines operate on variable schedule, using anticipation as a hook rather than consistent reward. This pattern goes beyond gambling. During the 20th century, research employing neurological scans revealed dopamine spikes, suggesting the brain reacts more intensely to the possibility of reward than to guaranteed ones. This implies that the brain values uncertainty, like a maybe, more than certainty, like a yes. This uncertainty seems to heighten attention, possessing a value akin to currency. The understanding of this neuroactivity could reshape leadership approach. In many high-pressure work environments, a pattern emerges: infrequent and erratic recognition, inconsistent guidance, unexpected promotions, and abrupt terminations. Access to the leader's approval turns into a rare reward, causing workers to become vigilant. They start scrutinizing meetings and dissecting minor comments for hidden meanings. Their performance isn't solely about achieving objectives. It's about adapting to the emotional state of their leader. These environments are often labeled as challenging or fast-paced. However, the reality feels like entering a workplace where the atmosphere changes without warning. You're constantly unsure of which version of the leader you'll encounter. This unpredictability is sometimes intentional. Leaders might act erratically to avoid becoming predictable. Predictable rewards lose their impact. Discipline that's too predictable can be circumvented. When both are unpredictable, it demands people's focus. A parallel can be drawn in relationship psychology. Studies on inconsistent reinforcement in romantic relationships suggest individuals experiencing hot-cold behaviors become more preoccupied than those in consistently warm or distant relationships. Unpredictability maintains their emotional investment. A moment of intense closeness might be followed by sudden withdrawal. The anxious partner tries harder, driven by the uncertainty. This notion challenges the idea that stability equals influence. Stability might create comfort, but uncertainty fosters vigilance. In behavioral models, unpredictability increases the frequency of checking behaviors. Consider how often people refresh their email or social media. Alerts arrive at irregular intervals, keeping users involved. Tech companies in Silicon Valley admit using behavioral studies to create anticipation, not just deliver content. For most individuals, this could be exhausting. Cortisol levels rise in constantly unpredictable environments. Studies on workplace stress discovered unclear roles and inconsistent guidance correlate with higher burnout rates compared to heavy workloads alone. Instability, not just hard work, is draining. From an influence standpoint, instability directs awareness toward the source. Machiavelli cautioned leaders about being hated, but didn't advocate for complete predictability. A leader who shifts alliances or makes sudden decisions can prevent competitors from collaborating. Uncertainty breeds hesitation. In game theory, unpredictable actions can be advantageous, preventing exploitation in competitive situations. The ethics become questionable when this transitions from defensive to manipulative. Some leaders create tension before talks by delaying responses. They ignore emails or postpone meetings without explanation. The delay becomes a tool in itself. This approach is often viewed as manipulative, as it exploits the human desire for patterns. When patterns are disrupted, attention sharpens. Influence shifts to the unpredictable origin. A paradox arises where chaos destroys trust and total stability reduces dependence. The key to influence lies in controlled unpredictability, enough variation to prevent complacency, but not enough to incite rebellion. For those being led, the effect is damaging. They check messages more often, rehearse conversations, and spend mental energy trying to understand signals that haven't even been sent. Eventually, focus narrows to the person or system causing the uncertainty. The situation turns darker when the goal becomes shaping minds, not just managing emotions. What happens when a subtle, underlying fear combines with unpredictability? Unpredictability captures attention, and fear calibrates obedience. This isn't about open threats or shouting, but about knowing actions have consequences that can arrive without notice. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that it's safer to be feared than loved, provided one avoids hatred. Fear must be controlled, rational, and impersonal, not driven by anger or cruelty, but by predictable consequences. Modern companies often forbid openly aggressive leadership behavior. Public embarrassment, obvious intimidation, and outbursts of anger can involve problems in the era of HR and social media. Yet, obedience persists and silence spreads. The system has evolved. The work of Amy Edmondson in 2013 noted that teams thrive when members feel safe speaking up. The absence of this safety leads to silence, withheld information, and increased risk. Corporate failures, like Enron or the Boeing 737 MAX disaster, revealed internal environments where workers hesitated to question decisions. Disagreement, even without open threats, could damage one's reputation. Here, fear becomes institutionalized, not just performative. Consider the firing process at high-performing companies. Some firms conduct harsh annual reviews, dismissing a percentage of the lowest performers. The reasons are often unclear. Leaders talk about merit, but workers understand that a single mistake can be decisive. Even without shouting, the knowledge that status is conditional alters behavior. Workers describe meetings as auditions, where guidance is filtered and questions are softened. The dominant emotion is vigilance, avoiding being made an example. This dynamic is driven by status threat. Studies have revealed that social rejection activates similar brain regions as physical pain. When status feels threatened, thinking becomes rigid and conformity to group norms increases. The fear isn't of physical danger, but of exclusion. Powerful people can convey these threats subtly through delayed responses, blank expressions, or sudden removal from invitation lists. These small signals have bigger effects in hierarchies, and individuals fill in the details. Remarkably, little open aggression is needed to maintain order. Open aggression can be counterproductive in modern workplaces, suggesting insecurity. Subtle signaling is more effective. A leader who calmly states, "We'll reconsider your fit here," creates more alarm than yelling because the uncertainty forces negative imagining. Research on social dominance reveals that individuals perceived as high status use fewer words, slower movements, and longer pauses. They interrupt less, but when they do, it's decisive. These subtle actions show they control attention rather than competing for it. The shift from individual actions to systemic pressure clarifies when fear is part of policy, not personality. Performance metrics impact pay, job assignments can stall careers, and public ranking systems exist within teams. Even when framed as transparency, these actions generate anxiety. Constant comparisons happen. Those in the roles often experience an awareness. They might reassure themselves they're respected, not scared because no one is yelling. Yet, they rehearse what they'll say before meeting with leaders, choose words with care, and check emails for tone. Respect and fear become intertwined. Machiavelli argued that stability comes from controlled fear, not cruelty. If punishments are predictable and impartial, people will adapt. Hatred emerges when fear seems capricious. The moral dilemma lies here. A system can function through low-level fear. Deadlines are met, targets are reached, and disagreement diminishes. However, innovation suffers when questions are dangerous, and unethical actions go unchallenged when silence seems safer than truth. Teams might even support leaders who intimidate them, rationalizing their behavior as simply challenging. The lines between respect and fear blur when outcomes are rewarded. The system sustains itself as long as results justify the climate. But something shifts internally for those under constant threat. Creativity narrows, risk-taking decreases unless approved, and the nervous system remains on high alert. This is how dominant systems work now. Subtle reminders of the consequences rather than raised voices. The contradiction grows sharper. If subtle fear brings obedience while suppressing revolt, what prevents its escalation until genuine respect is forgotten? When subtle fear creates compliance, morality becomes the only kind of defense layer. Once results are expected, the only threat to power is uprising. Ethical revolt begins with stating what is fitting. Who gets to choose that narrative? Some insight. Those who are asked to confirm their morals later feel they are permitted to do things opposing said morals. This finding extends from individuals to organizations. Corporate value statements are common, including integrity and transparency. However, investigations reveal differences between stated values and actual practice. Volkswagen documents after their scandal showed there was pressure on the message. The firm showed itself as a responsible one. Therefore, the reaction was softened by the community. Many had a hard time connecting the firm with the violation. Morality is not just a guide, but also a framework. Political strategists deeply grasp this. Reframing is changing uses of language and molding perceptions. Critical policy shifts are often accompanied by changes in how we describe them. Deaths of non-combatants become collateral damage. Changes to security become security enhancement. Increasing taxes can be called investments. The actions themselves remain the same, but the language creates a change on minds. Studies in political psychology showed small word changes could sway public opinions on the same idea. Initiatives presented as helping the poor received different levels of support compared to being labeled as aid to people on welfare, even if the group benefited was the same. Machiavelli believed in the significance of this dynamic. He suggested managers act faithful and moral, not because those are relevant, but because these helped make belief. He wanted narrative control. If the leader says what is, difficult choices become responsibilities. Controlling emotions and subtly creating fear strengthen position. Control over the moral explanation increases legitimacy. This impacts workers daily. A company might claim to value diversity, but only reward overwork and punish dissent. Layoffs are communicated as aligning with a strategy for long-term success. The language is sanitized. There are conflicts because the story makes sense. In order to remain, you have to conform. That mind conflict seems well. A view of past events says that a leader can be criticized when merging power, then viewed as a reformer if there are good results after. Good justifies ethical problems. Failure solidifies the disapproval. This makes influence. It helps to make the results to be a certain see or delay making a judgment. Some executives will say that long-term is necessary and will say that short sacrifices are for the long-term survival. Criticism goes away when numbers do well. When they don't, the same action is considered reckless. This shows that morality in a power position is fluid. Negotiated with stories, mutual gain strengthen. Those who control the view control what is accepted. This means that ethics are socially built, and their influence is top-down in hierarchies. This gives a sense of unrest because flexible morals protect managers. By making a story, using justifiable behavior, and calling them necessary, make the external criticism go away. Critics seem short-sighted. For the employees, this is hard to go against. To speak out means questioning the moral system, which hurts the reputation. You're not only disagreeing, but showing you're not loyal and unrealistic. Morality doesn't fail suddenly. It bends slowly. The language also changes. What was unthinkable seems realistic. If power can change views, ethics, and right and wrong, so what can never be touched by it? If morality can be reframed and put with fear into a system, then there is one final thing, which is make sure only certain people are permitted. This is not about plans, but your thoughts. If you have access, you have influence. In 1984, Robert Cialdini pointed out a basic human tendency. We tend to value what seems scarce. He tested this by showing people 2 jars of cookies. One jar was nearly empty, while the other was full. Even though the cookies were exactly the same, people found the cookies in the almost empty jar more appealing. The simple idea of limited availability made them more attractive. Consider how this relates to a person's character, especially in leadership. Leaders who overshare may become too predictable. People who report to them might start anticipating their moods. Coworkers could identify their weaknesses. Opponents might track their vulnerabilities. The things they reveal can be pieced together to form a readily available picture of the leader. I used to think that honesty was always the best way to build trust. While it can, studies on leadership suggest that leaders are often perceived as such because they control their emotions, communicate directly, and share information selectively. These leaders don't necessarily need to be particularly warm, but they remain in control. People see them as stable, even without knowing much about them personally. In this context, it might be less important for those in charge to be liked. Instead, a leader who isn't easily predictable can make others work harder to understand them, which gives an impression of depth. Certain ways of communicating are seen as having high status. Studies of judges, high-ranking officers, and managers have identified common traits. A measured way of speaking, the use of silence, few filler words, and selective honesty. They tend not to share their feelings, instead making choices from a removed position. Again, silence is powerful, shifting the focus onto others. Those in subordinate positions can feel uneasy in the face of this silence. Employees often describe such leaders as hard to read. Often, this is associated with both intimidation and respect. When leaders reveal too much about themselves, the workplace can feel less formal. When a leader listens without showing their reactions, it emphasizes the hierarchy. It boils down to who possesses what information. In negotiations, revealing too much can weaken one's stance. Research indicates that those who admit to deadlines tend to make concessions faster. The party that keeps their plans to themselves keeps more options open. Social media adds another layer of complexity, as these platforms tend to reward openness. Public figures still carefully manage their image. It's a performance of honesty. The complete person is never revealed. Leaders who are too open can be seen as insecure. A leader's authority might decrease when they become too relatable or manageable. Restraint allows others to imagine that person. When you share less, other people fill in the gaps, often exaggerating strengths or determination. It isn't magic, but perception. Centuries ago, Machiavelli advised hiding one's true feelings. Ambiguity can stop competitors from working together and exploiting vulnerabilities. For employees, this dynamic is obvious. They understand expectations and adapt accordingly, but they only see parts of their manager's thought processes. The same is true in relationships. The partner who shares only what they choose maintains influence. There is a price to pay. Excessive secrecy can create distrust. Without context, teams might create stories, which are usually negative. However, moderate secrecy can make others respect a leader. This psychological distance involves controlling emotions, creating uncertainty, and reframing morals. Limiting access limits influence. If protection turns into isolation, no one can influence that person. Controlling perception is fragile. In 1962, Richard Emerson said that power comes from controlling what others need, and reliance equates to vulnerability. Independence impacts vulnerability. The less dependent party has more power, not necessarily because of their personal qualities, but because of their many options. Having options can reshape negotiations. Research in behavioral economics shows that other choices change risk assessment. Back in the 1980s, people who had strong alternatives rejected unfair offers more often than those who did not. Those without alternative options often accepted less favorable terms to avoid losing out completely. Psychological studies suggest that individuals with very little savings experience higher stress and are more likely to obey in conflicts. If your livelihood depends on a single source, your choices shift. When leaders have wealth, income, or status outside of the company, they're likely to speak differently. They take more time, disagree more readily, and are less easily threatened as they are not tied to simply one option. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he also ran next and supported Pixar. His sense of self was not dependent upon the approval of a board. In comparison to founders who rely on investor relationships, he had a different negotiating position. Labor markets show that employees with the skills that many companies want often command higher wages. Performance reviews feel more like conversations when you have savings, connections, and opportunities outside your current role. When you have bills to pay and no savings, those same reviews can feel like judgment. Restricted options can change how we think. Research in the early 2000s showed that short-term restrictions can impair our ability to plan. That sense of psychological control comes not just from discipline, but from the awareness of other choices. Independence supports all the choices listed. Without that underpinning, each decision risks collapsing because it looks like a bluff. A manager who depends on mercenaries faces uncertainty. Emerson said, "Loyalty purchased temporarily could disappear." His ideas hold up today. Corporate governance shows that this structural idea protects companies from short-term pressures. Psychological dominance is, ultimately, reliance on authority and independence. Independence is not equally distributed. Systems are not fair. Some are closer to power than others. If you're easily replaceable, you may become more cautious. The less you need, the more freely you can act. If power is the ability to walk away, what happens to people in systems that remove that feeling? The examples described here support each other. Controlling perception builds emotion. Detachment reinforces that interior sense. Also, uncertainty destabilizes individuals. Subtle fear shapes behaviors. Moral narratives legitimize actions. Strategic ambiguity restricts access, and independence locks you in place. These aren't specific actions, but rather habits that, taken together, reduce outreach and connection. Those with emotional reactions might repeatedly adjust their judgments, and that may threaten their social position. The reactive person is readable. Exclusion can damage them, and their internal state is often observable. Compare that with the strategic person. Expressions are minimal. Those around might say they are calm, hard to read, etc. This isn't a trait, but something they project. The more emotional access you provide, the more you run the risk of losing influence and control. Control perception makes sure that external narratives never control you. Emotion is regulated so that it doesn't threaten your decisions. Subtle fear creates compliance without being mean. Moral reframing helps people justify their actions to maintain legitimacy. Limiting access creates value and adds credibility. Psychological untouchability isn't about being emotionally strong, but is about limiting emotional exposure. Individuals with this sense of untouchability cause certain reactions. In the corporate world, untouchability translates to appearing decisive and strong. While that kind of admiration seems desirable, it comes at the relationship cost that untouchability produces. Middle managers might reduce honesty, limit conversation, and project neutrality. Team members then stop arguing or expressing doubts, which decreases innovation but increases compliance. Power follows morality and affection. The survival of institutions depends on security. The most efficient models don't guarantee devotion. Each point of entry is guarded, which means fewer triggers that might destabilize the system. Power begins where emotional access ends. Insulation separates. Being unreachable limits closeness and interaction. Being unmoved by another isolates them and makes it harder to connect with the people around you. What does untouchability cost? That can be changed to increase success, but it comes at the cost of willingly being open to influence. When building and using these practices, are you trying to protect yourself from manipulation, or are you striving for dominance? The system is not static. If incentives determine loyalty and conditions shape allegiance, the question then becomes, who makes those conditions without becoming a target of resistance? Because the moment power becomes visible, it attracts opposition. Visibility creates enemies. Invisibility grows influence. History remembers the figure on the throne, never the architect. Behind many rulers, however, were those individuals whose names are largely forgotten. Cardinal Richelieu in 17th century France strengthened royal power while the king remained a symbolic figure. In the 20th century, figures like Martin Bormann operated within the Nazi structure without being charismatic. He controlled access, information flow, and administrative decisions. Control of access is power. I am struck by how consistently this pattern shows itself across different systems. Modern intelligence agencies are organized around this idea. The director might answer questions before lawmakers, but influence often lies with deputies, analysts, and field coordinators whose identities are kept secret. Compartmentalization makes sure that no one person embodies total control. The structure itself provides protection. Operations that fail bring accountability to one individual. Operations that achieve their aim spread. Research on people who display high levels of Machiavellianism, starting with Richard Christie and Florence Geis in the 1960s, showed that these individuals prefer indirect ways. They avoid open conflict. Bargaining experiments in the lab showed that participants who practiced Machiavellianism were more likely to delay commitment, find information quietly, and use unbalanced situations. They were after position, not appreciation. I have observed this dynamic in corporate environments more in boardrooms than in executive offices. The chief executive officer might seem like the decision maker, and they might deliver quarterly updates. But major strategic changes often originate from board members or major stakeholders who never have direct contact with employees. They have influence through compensation, succession planning, and performance measurements. A quiet vote can reshape entire careers. Employees might sense this asymmetry without fully understanding it. A department leader might announce restructuring. Staff might react emotionally, with anxiety, resentment, or fear. The real pressure, however, might have come from an investor call weeks earlier when analysts questioned profit margins. The visible authority absorbs all the concerns. The architect remains untouched. Studies of corporate misconduct support this view. Analyses of white-collar crime cases in the early 2000s revealed that planners of fraudulent schemes often avoided attention. They assigned risky situations, reduced exposure, and built reputations as disciplined and analytical professionals. Visibility would have increased scrutiny. Invisibility expanded options. There is a psychological reason for this. Recognition might boost ego, but it increases vulnerability. Experiments on status and backlash reveal that there can be negative reactions to high-status individuals when they violate expectations. When authority is explicit, mistakes are magnified. When influence is informal, then the obligation is diffused. I once thought that success automatically seeks recognition. That idea is not always true. Some of the people I have seen who were the most strategic deliberately avoided promotion. They remained advisors, chiefs of staff, senior analysts. They shaped agendas quietly. It looks like modesty, but it's insulation. Machiavelli himself hinted at this. He wrote about leaders, but he also discussed advisors who must seem loyal while building their own position. The appearance of devotion hides strategic calculation. Visibility is for show. Control is structural. This does not mean if you are unseen, that means you are all-powerful. Secret figures count on others trusting them, believing in controlled narratives. Remove information asymmetry, and their influence weakens. For ordinary people, the feeling is palpable. You might negotiate with your manager, not know that budget limits were set elsewhere. You might discuss policy in public, not knowing that the ideas came from think tanks earlier. You might challenge the figurehead while the system recalibrates behind it. The true danger is not a loud person demanding attention. It watches. It maps incentives. It understands how to time things emotionally. It shapes how things are viewed without attaching itself to them. And here's where things get sharper. The more effective the influence, the harder it is to trace. If power works best when it is unseen, then efforts to expose it might always be too late, which leaves an unsettling idea. When you look at the structure and think you know who has authority, are you looking at power or just its representation? If the most influence leaves no signs, then what we have isn't a few tricks, but a structure. Not a guide for dictators, but a model for how understanding, feeling, incentives, and perception connect. I resisted calling a system for a long time. Systems sound neat. What we have isn't neat. It adapts, it breathes. When I first read Niccolò Machiavelli carefully, not as a caricature, but as someone writing after exile in 1513, I saw something unsettling. He wasn't telling people to be cruel. He was describing how to be stable during unstable times. Florence in the early 16th century had political instability, alliances shifting, foreign armies moving through Italian states. His question wasn't how do you dominate, but instead how do you prevent collapse? Think about how morality works as a negotiation instead of a set of firm rules. In modern behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky showed, through their prospect theory, in 1979 that losses have a greater impact than gains. In experiments, people wanted twice as much to give up something as they were willing to pay to get it. Loss aversion isn't about ideology. It can be measured. When institutions phrase compliance as avoiding loss instead of achieving something, things become more predictable. I'm struck by how regularly this shows up in corporate compliance plans and political messaging. Then there is fear as a bonding force. In 2001, a series of studies following the September 11 attacks showed increased support for security policies when people felt more threatened. When primed with mortality cues in terror management theory experiments, people showed more support for strong leadership. Love inspires. Fear coordinates. Emotion coming before reason isn't speculation. Antonio Damasio's work in the 1990s with patients who had ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage revealed that people with damaged emotional processing struggled to make even simple choices. They could calculate endlessly but couldn't make a decision. In marketing, this translates into campaigns that connect with identity before mentioning features. Apple's Think Different campaign in 1997 didn't start with processor speed. It tapped into people's connections with rebels and creators. Specifications came later. Control of perception adds to this effect. In 1993, Iyengar and Kinder showed, through framing experiments, that issues emphasized heavily in news reports influenced which problems viewers considered most important. This agenda-setting effect didn't need false information. Selection alone shifted people's view. Corporate branding works the same. When British Petroleum rebranded as Beyond Petroleum in the early 2000s, visual logos changed how the company was viewed even while operations remained based on fossil fuels. The narrative came first. Choosing what to reveal can stabilize shaky systems. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, John F. Kennedy publicly announced a naval quarantine while privately agreeing to remove missiles from Turkey months later. Being fully transparent in real time might have caused domestic opposition or increases. The secrecy wasn't virtuous. In organizations, I've seen managers hold back preliminary restructuring talks to prevent sudden resignations caused by panic. If rumors get out early, productivity drops before anything is finalized. It's nice to be transparent. Timing is crucial. Incentives outlast promises. Game theory simulations, like Robert Axelrod's tournaments in the 1980s, showed that strategies based on cooperation outperformed blind trust. Tit for tat was simple. Cooperate at first, then copy the other person's last move. People remained loyal when they could expect it in return. Remove any consequences and things changed. Corporate turnover rates back this up. When people are not compensated in line with their values, employees leave. Trust falls apart not because speeches fail, but because incentives go against them. Finally, there is invisibility as protection. Organizational studies of board governance reveal that strategic shifts usually start in compensation committees or shareholder coalitions rather than in executive speeches. The leader on the surface absorbs appreciation and criticism. The network adjusts below the surface. This metaphorical network clarifies the setup. Understanding, feeling, incentive, narrative, secrecy, and seeing interacting all at once. Power isn't structured top to bottom. Instead, it's a web of feedback loops. For employees inside such systems, the experience is disorienting. You feel moral disagreement when policies shift. You explain away choices you did not make. You sense pressure without knowing where it comes from. Official explanations rarely describe what's happening. It's comforting to think that society is guided mainly by shared rules. This doesn't require negativity. It requires awareness. Reading Machiavelli as a psychologist makes him less monstrous. He observed that appearances maintain order, that fear stabilizes faster than affection, that alliances last when interests are in line. Modern research in neuroscience, behavioral economics, and communication fills in the holes he could only assume. Control against chaos is the underlying tension. Too much rigidity and systems may break. Too much transparency and volatility may increase. Too much visible control and opposition may concentrate. I am hesitant because this model might sound like I want it. Understanding a mechanism doesn't justify it, but ignoring it means you are governed by it. Being intellectually dangerous isn't about being cruel, it's about seeing its setups. And once you see it, you can't go back.